This video is going to cover the installation of Bch Api. Bch Api is a REST API that wraps the core Bitcoin Cash infrastructure. So if we go to the fullstack.cash page, you can see an illustration here of how it works. There's these underlying full node, Fulcrum Indexer, and SLP Indexer, and the REST API wraps those pieces of infrastructure under it and provides one common API endpoint in order to access all that infrastructure. So Bch Api, the code for it, it lives on GitHub under the Permissionless Software Foundation GitHub group in a repository called Bch Api. You can see the URL right there. And then again, here's another graphical image of what's going on. You've got the full node, you've got the token indexer, and the Fulcrum Indexer, which both talk to the full node, and then REST API talks to all three of those and provides one common REST API. So the steps for installing it is let's inspect the underlying infrastructure that I covered in previous videos on how to set up, just so that you can see what it looks like when it's running, when that lower level infrastructure is running properly. Then we'll customize the startup script, customize the Docker Compose file, then we can bring Bch Api up, and then finally we can test it with Bch.js to make sure that everything's configured correctly. So I'm over here in on the desktop that I've been working on. If I go Docker PS, I've got the full node. These two are Fulcrum, and then I've got this SLP indexer all running. So let's take a look at what they look like when they're running properly. I'm going to go Docker logs -- tail 20 for the last 20 lines, F for follow. I'm going to do this for all the other containers. So let's look at the full node first. So this is what the full node looks like when it's running properly. It says progress 1.0. That means it's fully synced. You can see the last few blocks that came in where it says height. So that's what the full node looks like when it's running properly. So let's look at the Fulcrum Indexer. So you can see here it's just keeping track of the mempool. These are unmined transactions that are hanging out waiting to be mined in a block. So that's what that looks like. And then the Fulcrum REST API is just basically a REST API wrapper for the other container. You may not see this. These are from previous interactions that I've been making, but they are. This tells me that it's running correctly. Seeing a lot of 200s, which is a HTTP status for success. And then finally, the SLP indexer. This is what it looks like when it's fully synced. It's basically every, I think, 250 milliseconds it's polling to see if the full node has let it know of a new transaction. When the 0 flashes to a 1, that's a transaction on the Bitcoin Cash network that it's analyzing. So that's what all the infrastructure looks like when it's running correctly. And here in this work infra directory, these are the different piece of infrastructure that I set up in previous videos. So I'm going to go ahead and clone Bch Api. And I'm going to run the production Docker container in this just like I have for all the other infrastructures. That's in the Docker mainnet directory. And there's this start local mainnet and Docker Compose file that we'll want to customize. So we can see from here all the different ports. So the full node's running on port 8332. That's the RPC port. We're going to need to know that. The Fulcrum REST API is on port 3001, and the SLP indexer is on port 5010. So we're going to need that information. So I'm going to edit the startup script with nano, And 172.17.01, that is the local network of the Docker containers. So that's going to be pretty standard everywhere. A lot of these are if you leave the defaults, they're going to be fine. This is the default login name and password for the RPC. This is the default port. We're going to ignore SLPDB because that is being phased out. These are the different Fulcrum settings. This Fulcrum API is the one that's important. Port 3001, we already looked and saw that that's on port 3001, and V1, that needs to be in that URL there. These settings are less important. They'll also be phased out in the future. Bch API uses Redis to track for rate limiting, but that's going to be part of the Docker container, so we don't need to touch that setting. Let's see. Local REST URL. So this is if it sometimes Bch API calls Bch.js within itself, and so it's just going to use its local port in order to basically it's going to call itself. That's what that is. These are for basic authentication for rate limits. I'm not going to cover rate limits in this video. I actually have this do not use rate limits. Looks like it comes by default. So by default, it does not use rate limiting. Let's see. So because rate limiting is not used, these don't matter. This whitelist, you can change that. It doesn't matter. That's again rate limiting. A lot of this has to do with like rate limiting in a production situation like fullstack.cache uses. These are going to control the number and size of logs that are retained. This Bcache server is just a placeholder. Just use the default value. It doesn't matter. It's not really used. This SLP Indexer API is going to be used. That's the new SLP Indexer. I'm pretty sure port 5010 is going to be okay. That's what we want to use. 5010, yeah, that's what we said there. So it looks like the defaults there are set just fine. Let's check out the Docker Compose file. It's going to be on port 3000, and it's going to set up a Redis container to talk to. So it looks like all the defaults are exactly what they need to be. So I'm going to go ahead and build this from scratch. And I'll let this build, and then we'll test to see if everything's actually configured correctly. Okay, the Docker container has finished building. So let's try and bring this up. And I'm going to follow the logs. Okay, so this is a good sign. It was able to make its initial connections at least, and it successfully is running on port 3000. So in order to test this, the best way to test it is Bch.js. So Bch.js is the JavaScript library that is closely coupled with Bch API. So if I go into the infra directory, here are the 4 folders that we set up. Bch.js, actually there's a link right here, but if you go to the Permissionless Software Foundation GitHub group, Bch API and Bch.js are 2 of the 6 pinned repositories. So I'm going to go into Bch.js here, and this is actually an NPM library. That's typically how it's used, but we're going to set up a development environment to run some development tests. So I'm going to clone that Bch.js directory, and I'm going to install the JavaScript dependencies. This will take a second. Okay, so if we look at the package.json file, I'm going to cat it to write it to the screen here. There are all these scripts in here, and test integration is used to test like the fullstack.cache integration. We're going to use this Decatur BCHN test. This is for testing it locally. So I'm going to use nano and edit that package.json file. And what I want to do is find this line with Decatur BCHN and then change this to 172.17.0.1, which is the IP address of our local Docker LAN. And again, port 3000, which is what we set Bch Api to run on, and we're using the v5 route. So now we can go npm run test integration bch Decatur bchn. Alright, let's run that and see how it goes. It should go pretty fast. Okay, so in this case, everything was set up correctly. If you see red, then that means that there's something wrong with your setup. So let me walk through these tests real quick. So blockchain is talking to the blockchain, so that's interacting with the full node. So if you see red in this section, there's probably a problem with the blockchain. Same with control. Electrum X is the Fulcrum Electrum X indexer, so if there's red here, then there's something wrong with the connection between Bch Api and your Fulcrum indexer. These prices are actually being pulled externally from the internet, so if they're red, that's not a big deal. They'll probably fix themselves with a little time. Raw transactions, again, are the blockchain and the full node. Double spend proofs. Here's the PSF SLP indexer. So if these are red, then it's having a trouble talking to the SLP indexer. And then same with these UTXOs. These are mostly an interaction with the SLP indexer, and yeah, and so that's pretty much covers most of them. These are raw transactions. That's the full node. So sort of depending on which section the red stuff is in, then that determines like the specific piece of infrastructure that you're having issues with, and so just use those Docker logs commands to inspect your different containers. So this is great. This is up. Bch Api is up and running. In the next section, I'll show how to set up the IPFS BCH wallet service provider, and then pipe to be able to pipe a connection to all this infrastructure over IPFS. But this is if you're basically trying to set up a development server for yourself or for a small or medium-sized company, this is pretty much the end of it. Bch Api wraps all those infrastructures. You can now go to, let's see, what is my IP address? Here's the IP address of the machine. So if I bring that up, port 3000. Oh, it's trying to make an HTTPS connection. There we go. So you have to do HTTP and then port 3000, and then here is the API documentation for the REST API. So these are the REST API endpoints on port 3000 that you can now talk to. This is what BCH.js would call when it's running inside of an app. And you can click on any of these, so like check on the indexer status, check the balance token balance for an address, get prices for Bitcoin Cash, send a raw transaction to the Bitcoin Cash network. So these are all the different API. Unfortunately, the coloring sucks, but that'll get fixed. But yeah, so basically you're off and running. Pat yourself on the back. This is a great milestone.